I lived in Pennsylvania, in a rural area surrounded by forested hills and long stretches of untouched land. My closest neighbor, Matt, lived almost a mile down the road. Both of our homes were isolated, bordered by dense woods that seemed endless and mysterious. The kind of place where silence was broken only by the rustle of leaves or the occasional distant cry of an animal. It was the perfect setting for something eerie to happen. One evening, Matt came over to my place, as he often did. We were just hanging out when he mentioned something unusual he had found. He said he'd stumbled upon a tunnel in the woods behind his house. It wasn't just any tunnel. It was old, supported by wooden beams, and gave him a bad feeling. He admitted he didn't want to explore it alone. "How far is it?" I asked, intrigued but cautious. "Maybe a mile's walk behind my house," he replied. "There's no path or anything leading to it, though." The more he described it, the more curious I became. A hidden tunnel deep in the woods? It sounded like something out of a horror movie. I agreed to go with him, though I felt a little thrill of apprehension. I grabbed my small backpack, stuffed it with a flashlight and a water bottle, and we drove to his house to begin our journey. It was only 5 p.m. when we started walking, so we had a good 2 hours of daylight left. We figured that would be enough. The trek through the forest was uneventful at first. Just the usual sounds of nature surrounding us, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the occasional chirp of a bird. After about 20 minutes, we arrived. The structure was exactly as Matt had described. A simple tunnel entrance, supported by weathered wooden beams. It looked ancient, as though it had been forgotten for decades. There was nothing else around it. No signs, no tools, no remnants of work. It seemed to exist entirely on its own. A strange anomaly in the middle of nowhere. Matt took the flashlight out of my bag and shone it inside. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing a straight passage lined with more wooden beams. The walls were bare, damp, and rough. I assumed it was an abandoned mine, but something about it felt off. Old mines usually had some leftover signs of activity, rails, crates, or scattered tools. This tunnel had none of that. It was empty. Matt led the way and I followed close behind. As soon as we stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply. The air was damp and carried an earthy, metallic smell. Every step we took echoed down the tunnel, amplifying the eeriness. After about a minute, we reached the end of the straight passage. Another tunnel branched off to the left. On the wall at the intersection, there was writing, an arrow pointing back the way we had come, with the word exit scrawled beneath it. The letters were jagged, as if scratched hastily into the stone. We turned left, but just a few steps in, we stopped. Trash was piled against the walls, garbage bags, food wrappers, and water bottles. At first glance, it seemed like someone had been there recently. But what made it even stranger was the condition of the trash. The items were pristine, without a speck of dust. Considering the amount of dust falling from the ceiling, this was deeply unsettling. Matt tried to play it off, saying it was probably just teenagers hanging out here earlier. Still, the thought didn't ease my nerves. He started walking again, but as his footsteps grew fainter, I felt a chill. I stopped and looked back, scanning the darkness behind us. The shadows seemed to shift and move, but nothing was there. "Matt?" I called. When I turned back toward him, he was frozen, staring ahead. His body was tense, his breathing shallow. "Matt, what's wrong?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond at first. He just stood there, staring into the shadows of another branching tunnel. Then, in a barely audible whisper, he said, "I'm sorry." Before I could ask what he meant, he backed up quickly, motioning for me to follow him. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. I didn't argue. As we turned to leave, a deafening bang echoed through the tunnel. The sound was so loud and sudden that it felt like the walls were closing in around us. We sprinted, our footsteps pounding against the cold stone floor, the echoes chasing us like a living thing. My chest burned, but I didn't stop until we burst out into the open air. Even then, we didn't feel safe. We jogged all the way back to Matt's house, glancing over our shoulders the entire way, convinced we were being followed. Once inside, we locked the door and sat in silence. Matt's face was ghostly pale, his hands trembling. I had to ask, "What did you see?" I demanded. "Was someone in there?" He hesitated, staring at the floor. Then he finally spoke, his voice low and shaky. "There was a man," he said. "He was unclothed. He was sitting in the next tunnel, holding something, a squirrel or a rabbit, I think. He was gutting it like he was going to eat it." A wave of nausea washed over me. I wanted to laugh it off, to say he was joking, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't. He was genuinely terrified, and now so was I. We never went back to that tunnel. Matt seemed to recover after a few days, but the memory of that night lingered with me. Whether it was some recluse living in the wilderness or something more sinister, I'll never know. What I do know is that we were lucky to leave unharmed. When you wander into places you don't belong, you never know what or who you might find. This happened only a year ago. At the time, it had been quite a while since my last camping trip, and for months leading up to this, I had a nagging desire to get out into nature again. Camping had always been my escape, a way to disconnect from the world and recharge. I finally got some time off work and immediately began planning a trip. There was a mountain range about a 2-hour drive from where I lived. It wasn't a well-known spot, which was perfect for me. I wasn't looking for crowds or popular trails. I just wanted solitude. After scrolling through some online maps, I decided to just wing it and choose a trail once I got there. My main goal wasn't the hike itself. I was more interested in setting up a quiet campsite and relaxing for a few days. I packed 4 days' worth of camping supplies and food, then set off early in the morning. The drive was peaceful, winding through rural areas and thick woods as I approached the mountain. Since it wasn't a popular location, parking options were scarce. Eventually, I found a small dirt plot on the side of the road that seemed suitable. I parked, grabbed my gear, and began walking along the road until I came across one of the camping trails. The map posted at the trailhead was old and faded, but I could make out that the trail went several miles into the forest and up the mountain. At a certain point, it split into 3 paths, each leading to different camping spots. That seemed straightforward enough, so I started my hike. It took about 2 hours to reach the split. The trails all looked the same, overgrown and narrow, but I chose the left one, figuring it was as good a choice as any. 30 minutes later, I arrived at the camping grounds. It was an open area with fewer trees, but it was clear no one had been there in a long time. The ground was overgrown with weeds and moss, and if it weren't for the faint path leading there, it would have looked like any other random spot in the forest. I dropped my bags next to a large tree and started setting up camp. My tent went up quickly, and afterward, I sat on a fallen log to eat my lunch. The forest was quiet, the only sounds being the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I pulled out my journal and began writing, letting the calmness wash over me. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I realized I needed to gather firewood before it got too dark. I wandered around the perimeter of the campsite, collecting sticks and fallen branches. That's when I noticed something odd. A narrow path leading deeper into the woods. It wasn't part of the marked trails. This was a footpath, the kind that forms when someone walks the same route repeatedly over time. What struck me as strange was how clear and well-trodden it was. Usually, such paths get overgrown quickly if they're not used regularly. I finished gathering wood and returned to the campfire, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. That path felt out of place, and I was too curious to ignore it. Before settling in for the night, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and a small bag, then started following the path. The further I walked, the more certain I became that someone had been using this trail recently. After about 15 minutes, I reached the end. Out in the middle of the woods stood a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked ancient and abandoned, with splintering wood, missing boards, and an air of decay. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. I stepped closer, my curiosity overpowering my unease. Why would there be a well-trodden path leading to an old, forgotten cabin? It didn't make sense. As I peered through the doorway, I could barely make out the interior. It was dark, but I could tell there were objects inside. Furniture, maybe, or something else. Just as I was about to step inside, a voice behind me made me freeze. "Leave. Go away." The voice was stern, almost angry. I spun around to see a man standing about 10 feet away. His expression was unreadable, but his tone left no room for argument. He repeated himself, his voice low and commanding. Without a word, I nodded and backed away, turning toward the path. I could feel his eyes on me as I walked, and when I glanced back, he was still there, standing at the edge of the path, watching me. By the time I made it back to my campsite, it was already dark. The unease from earlier had turned into full-blown fear. There was no way I was staying there for the night. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands trembling. The forest seemed darker than ever, the shadows closing in around me. With only my flashlight to guide me, I began the dangerous hike back to my car. Every sound made me jump. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. My heart pounded in my chest the entire way. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear inside and sped off, not stopping until I was back home. Even now, I can't shake the memory of that man. He didn't look like someone who lived out there. His clothes were clean, and there was no sign that he had been roughing it in the woods. So why was he there? And if he didn't live in the cabin, who did? The well-worn path suggested regular use, but by whom? And for what purpose? I'll never know the answers to those questions, but the thought of it still sends chills down my spine. Whatever was going on out there, I'm just glad I didn't stick around to find out. My best friend Glenn and I grew up in a small town, far from many big cities. The population was less than 1,000, so yeah, it was very local and everyone knew everyone. Growing up, rumors would spread about various creepy things that supposedly went on in the town. Most likely fake. But one of the rumors that would always resurface was about this small community a few miles out in the surrounding woods. The town had been abandoned decades ago. By the time Glenn and I were in high school, we found out from multiple people that the community was actually real, and there was a whole history to it. After finding that out, it was impossible for us to resist the urge to go out there and see what all the talk was about. We tried planning the whole trip out, but in the end, we just packed a backpack with some water and flashlights, then headed into the woods. We got some basic directions to this poorly made trail that supposedly led there and followed it for about 3 miles. But then it ended. There were no other trails or anything. It was just a dead end. My immediate thought was that we'd been set up for some elaborate prank, but Glenn wasn't convinced. He somehow got me to follow him for another half-mile through the woods, not following any trail or directions. By then, we'd already been out longer than expected, and the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky. I was nervous about getting lost without the sunlight or a clear path to follow, but just before we decided to turn back, Glenn spotted a shape in the distance. It was too far to see exactly what, but it was rigid, definitely man-made. As we got closer, the shape revealed itself to be a worn and broken down cabin. The roof had caved in, and it looked like people had been around here recently. But when we walked around to the other side of the cabin, we saw something strange. A large field where all the trees had been cut down. In the middle of the field stood 6 cabins of varying sizes, along with a few other structures that I couldn't really identify. Both of us were shocked to actually have found this place, and in person it was way creepier than we ever could have imagined. The houses were all falling apart in one way or another. We walked over to one of the cabins close to us and went inside. It was trashed, but it looked like most of the furniture, wooden chairs and tables, was still intact and sitting in the same place it had been decades ago. The sunset was casting long shadows on everything, which really just added to the eerie feeling of the place. I walked into what I think was supposed to be the bedroom, but as I looked around, I heard someone walking outside the cabin. I turned around to give Glenn a nervous look, but he wasn't there. Staying quiet, I looked through a crack in the wall to see if the person outside was Glenn. But as the footsteps came closer, I caught sight of them. It was a tall old man, mid-50s, half naked, and the clothes he did have on were torn and disgusting. He walked past the cabin, and I turned back, starting to look through the rooms for Glenn. But he must have left at some point. I exited through an empty window frame and stayed behind the cabin as I tried to scan the whole field for any sign of Glenn. But I saw no signs of him. I assumed he was exploring one of the other houses, but I had no idea if he was even aware of the man who had just entered the abandoned community. In my frantic state, I realized I had lost sight of the man. I was struggling to keep myself calm, and the whole woods were getting darker by the minute. Then, all of a sudden, there was a horrifying scream from the other side of the abandoned town. I peered around the cabin and saw Glenn running through the open field. Once he saw me, we both ran into the woods back toward home. Thankfully, we found the trail before the sun fully set, because once it went down, we could only see a few feet ahead. When we finally got back, I asked Glenn what happened. He said he was exploring one of the houses, and as he did, he started to realize that it didn't look as abandoned as the others. Someone was likely living there. When he turned to leave, the same man I had seen was standing on the other side of the cabin, holding a knife. He described the man's eyes as having a look of hunger, and without hesitation, the man charged at him. Glenn screamed and ran, and I guess the man didn't chase very far. We don't know what that man would have done to us, but it was stupid to have even gone to that abandoned town in the first place. It almost cost us our lives to figure that out.